All right, do you want to get started?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Richie asked me to give you this talk, and she gave me the goal of doing three things. She wanted to know what kind of software package should you be using to make effective scientific graphics. She wanted me to tell you how to use that package to make effective scientific graphics, and she wanted me to tell you what are the principles of making scientific graphics. And she said, please, Melissa, go on and take up to 30 minutes to do this. And she asked to have my helper with me. So that's a really tall order. So what I'm going to have to do is cut this down a little bit, and I'll talk about what packages I think you should use for designing scientific graphics. And I'm going to talk about some broad things that you should be thinking about. And then I'll give you some ideas of where you can learn a little bit more about it. So let's go on and get going. To design effective scientific graphics, you need professional quality software. And by professional quality software, I don't mean PowerPoint. PowerPoint is presentation software. It does not have the capability of generating good graphics of the type that you would want to be publishable or the type you would want your job to be resting on. So I've done a broad overview of what is available today. And I think that there are really two packages that you should be considering for using to make scientific graphics. And the first one is by far and away the industry leader, the best one. This is the packages that are offered by Adobe. Adobe Illustrator is used for making vector graphics. Adobe Photoshop is used for making raster graphics, so working with things like photos. They have been the industry leader for 34 years. They're not going to go anywhere. You're pretty much guaranteed that whatever you make in Illustrator and Photoshop are going to be available for pretty much the rest of your career. Available on Mac, Windows, and iPad. The only thing about them is that, in my opinion, they are insanely expensive. So for students, it's going to be $30 per month to get them. For faculty and staff, it's $35 per month. And once you leave academia, it'll be $42 per month. And so in my opinion, unless you can get onto a site license, which is actually what I use, which is only open to faculty at Cornell, this is just too much to be paying for what you are getting. The good news is that Illustrator and Photoshop have set the standard for graphics design. And so because of this, there are emerging candidates that are essentially clones. And the best one today is going to be Affinity Designer. And Affinity Designer does what Adobe should have done. It combines both raster graphics and vector graphics in one package. It has definitely been designed to be an Illustrator and Photoshop killer. It has very good reviews. I know people who use it. It is almost as powerful as what is offered by Adobe. Some of the advanced things that are in Photoshop are not in Designer, but you can buy Affinity Photo, which has some advanced tools like the Magic Wand tool. It reads Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop files. It writes many different types of files. It's available on Mac, Windows, and iPad. And the wonderful thing is that Designer is $50, and you just have to buy it one time. If you want photo, that's an additional $50, and there's a free demo for it. So that is what I would recommend that almost all of you do. If you are on Linux and not using something like Wine, or if you just prefer open source, one option, and I think the only option that is well reviewed, is Inkscape. It is open source, so you know the advantages and disadvantages of that. But I highly recommend that you get one of these and start using it for designing your graphics. Okay, so that's my recommendation for software. Richie then asked me to show you how to use that. Boy, that would take a really long time. I suggest you just Google how to use this as you were working through it. There are a lot of great YouTube videos or tutorials on how to use either one of these packages. What I want to spend the rest of my time talking about is the principles of graphic design. So how do you design something that is effective in doing what you want, which is in communicating your message clearly, effectively, and without any confusion. And so I think that you need to learn at least the principles of graphic design. And I've spent actually quite a while trying to find resources for my students to learn about it. And I've only found one good book on it that I think is a really good introduction. And it's this one. It's by Robin Williams, and it's called The Non-Designer's Design Book. It's now in its fourth edition. It's a really easy read. It's got lots of examples. After reading this book, you will realize that you have almost internally known a lot of graphic design, but it gives you some very clear ideas about how to design graphics. And so highly recommended. It's not by this Robin Williams, though. It's actually by a different Robin Williams who's been a graphic designer since at least I was in graduate school. So I suggest you get on Amazon and read this. Almost all of the rest of my talk is going to be coming from this book because I think that it is so good. And I feel bad about blatantly stealing. So hopefully some of you will buy this to make up for that. So she condenses all of graphic design into 4 simple ideas. And the 4 ideas, oh, before I say that, let me tell you why you're interested in graphic design. The reason you're interested in graphic design is not so much because I want your scientific presentations to be beautiful. I mean, of course I want them to be beautiful, but that's not going to get you a job. If your science isn't good, no one is going to care. No one has ever gotten a job in physics or chemistry because they are great artists. However, when you go out to get a job, when you go out to defend your proposals, what you're going to have to do is going to sell a fairly complicated bit of physics or chemistry or whatever to your audience. And you're going to have a limited amount of time. And so because of that, you're going to have to present your ideas in a very clear format. You are going to have to know how to steer your audience's attention, how to steer your audience's eyeballs to exactly what you are talking about. You're going to need to present your ideas, your data in a very linear format, one that takes your audience from the beginning of your story all the way to the end of your story. And the great thing about that is that there's an entire industry that does this. And of course, it's the advertising industry. And they're the ones who first, went up and formulated these principles of graphic design. So the things that I'm going to say in the rest of this talk sound a lot like they come from Mad Men. And they do, because people in advertising are very good at selling things. And so remember, in graphic design, your goal is to steer the attention of the people that you are talking to. Okay, so what are these principles? As I said, Robin Williams came up with 4 principles of graphic design. They are contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. Now, I have no idea how you can remember all of these 4. I guess just write them down, say them a lot to yourself or something like that. But if you just remember these, you will find it much easier to design effective scientific graphics. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk through each of these, not in this order, and give you the highlights of what you should be thinking of. And then at the end, I'm going to bring this home and talk about how you would use it, for example, to design a scientific poster. As some of you know, I have a completely different talk on scientific presentations, which is parallel to this. If you've not seen it, I do recommend it. And this is just going to be focused primarily on what you need to be thinking about for designing your graphics and for designing your scientific posters. Okay, so let's get started with the first of these principles. And I want to start off with proximity. And this is sort of obvious that items that are related to each other should be grouped close together, okay? Because when things are grouped close together, naturally your eye, your thoughts will group them together, and it helps people understand complicated graphics in just a quick look. So let's walk through a quick quick example of how you can use proximity. Here is an example of a very bad business card. And the reason I say that it's bad is because when you look at this business card, clearly you see Mermaid Tavern, but then your eyes get confused. Your eyes don't know where to go. Do they go up here to see Ralph Oyster Doyster? Do they go down here or over here? There's no grouping. There's no natural story that's going on here. So I think it will come as no surprise. The better thing to do is to try and group this information in logical blocks. So for example, one of the things you could do is to try and bring someone's eyes up to the name of the person in the business card, which is Ralph Royster Doyster. Here they did it by just, increasing the contrast. But it's probably better to try and bring these two together by doing something more like this. So having the name underneath and then bringing all of the items that have to do with the location together. So the information is now prioritized and organized. This is obviously not anything terribly surprising to you. I'm sure you would all do this, making business cards, but that's the first idea behind proximity. Here's another example, and I'm sure you've all seen advertisements like this scattered around campus, and you see what they're trying to do. They're trying to get people to come and learn to dance, and they're trying to have this really, happy-go-lucky, oh, you can do hip hop, you can do clown, you can do funk, you can do Saturdays. Oh, wait, Saturdays. Well, Saturdays isn't a type of dance. And so even though it's trying to be cute and engaging, it kills itself because you don't know where to look. You don't understand the structure of this. So of course, what you would try to do is introduce some kind of formatting to this. And so doing it like this, where it's learn to dance, tell people where this is going, break up the different types of dancing, say what kinds of different dances they can learn, and then, the good stuff, free tea and scones at the bottom. So this is proximity. Everything should be related to other things when you design your graphics. Here is another example. This is for the Shakespeare Papers, which I suppose is some kind of magazine. And at first, when you look at it, it looks pretty appealing. So nice color scheme here. It says the Shakespeare Papers. Then your eyeballs go up to the left. And so it's put out by the Sweet Swan Society, which apparently is amusing, peculiar, and educative, which sounds a little bit strange for a society. And then there are other things that are just floating off by themselves. Volume 26, number 9, October 2012. So having things just floating around randomly is a good way to lose your audience's attention as they're trying to figure out what should they be looking at? What is the most important thing? What ideas should be grouped together? So again, very straightforward. What you should do is try and work on the grouping. So a much better way of doing this is to bump up the size of the Shakespeare Papers. And of course, it's the Shakespeare Papers that are amusing, peculiar, and educative, not the Sweet Swan Society. So by breaking this up into two different blocks, first the title block and the explanation of the title, and then who is putting it out and what's the volume and such, that makes it much easier to grasp at an instant what is trying to be communicated. Okay, here is something that is very common when you look at students' submissions. They will have some kind of organized list. And if you look at this list, what you can see, if you look at it a little closely, you can see that there are actually something like 6 headers here. And underneath each of these headers, there's a list of something. So that's a pretty standard kind of thing. But in order to look and to see that we have 6 different things going on in this list, it does take a little bit of effort because there's not a big difference between our header and the stuff that goes into the header. So a better way of doing this would be to add some proximity to it and also maybe to add a little bit of contrast to it. So here, bringing each one of these different groups closer together and leaving some white space in between them makes it much easier to see at a glance that there are 6 different collections of things. So graphic designers say one of the biggest pitfalls of people who are first starting out in this is not realizing that white space is just as important as all of the other stuff, as all of the little graphics that you put in, because the white space is one of the things that helps your audience understand the different things that are in your graphic. So notice in each of these, there is the same amount of white space between each group. And I've also bumped up the contrast so you can see the headers much more quickly. Okay. So the second principle of graphic design is alignment. And this is really, really important. And the most important part is this sentence right here. Nothing should be placed on your graphic arbitrarily. Okay, you shouldn't have things that are just placed over in the upper right-hand side because there's a big white space there. You need to place the items in your graphic so that you are steering eyeballs, so that people know, what should I look at first? What should I look at second? What is connected to what other thing? So the rule is that every element needs to have a visual connection with another element on the page. And by doing this, just making subtle changes to your graphics, you will make things that look more sophisticated, more clean, and more fresh. So let's look at a couple of examples of this. So here is this business card again that has a center justification, which is I think what most people reach for their first graphic. And center justification does work. It does pull this top together with this bottom, but it's a very weak form of justification. And it's a very weak form of alignment because you have to imagine the center line. So in general, it's better to do something else. So for example, in this case, you could have a hard right alignment of everything, and it just looks better. It looks fresher. And there is this little dotted line here to show you this hard right alignment. Of course, I wouldn't actually use that in the graphic, but it does pull the top together with the bottom. So a hard edge, either on the right or on the left, gives more strength to the layout and it gives more connection. So a second example, this looks like every lab report that has ever been turned in to any course that I have ever taught. Center aligned, everything is the exact same size, and they actually use this exact same lineup. So that's fine for lab reports, but if you're actually doing something that's important, like an annual report, not a good way to get things to stand out. So one way to make it stand out is to change the alignment. And just by going to a hard left alignment, it looks better. Maybe put up a little bit more contrast for the title. But now that you have this hard left alignment, there's much more connection between the top and the bottom than there is here, where there's much less space between them. So professional graphic designers very rarely use a center justification or a center alignment for the different things in their graphics. Here is a better example of this same idea. This is a draft for the cover of a book about poems from Robert Burns. And so you can see that the title, the author, Robert Burns, is connected to the poems in Scots and English. But when I first look at that, my first thing is that why is there a carriage return in the middle of poems in Scots and English? Why not have the same layout as you have with the top? And then you have this down here that's just sort of drifting off in the middle by itself. There's no connection between these two. So one way of taking care of this would be to try and have them all have some kind of relationship to one another. And one way to do this, which makes it look, I think, better than what just a left alignment or a right alignment, would be to introduce what is called a rule. And a rule is not an underline, it is a line, it is a graphic element that's designed to pull together this top piece with this bottom piece. And so notice that the left edge and the right edge are connected by the length of the line. And now the form of Robert Burns matches the form of the title. And so it looks much more put together. It looks much more professional. This looks like something you could buy in a bookstore. This does not look very good. You would not see a book that looks like this. Okay, so with that idea, you might think that, well, what I should do is I should have a hard left edge and a hard right edge. So why not make my stuff all full justification? And the problem with full justification is it only works for certain font sizes. And even this font size I find to be a little bit too small. So what am I talking about? You'll notice that in this larger font size example here, the spacing between the words is gigantic. It just doesn't look like normal text. And so one way to convince yourself about this, and the way that graphic designers say is the best way, is to take your text, print it out, and then what you do is you turn it upside down and you look to see if you can see rivers. And so I can immediately see there is a river of white that goes all the way down this text, and there shouldn't be a river. In the smaller text, you can see little regions of river, which is why I don't like PowerPoint's fonts, but you don't have huge rivers that go all the way up and down. So you need to pick a font size and a justification that match. If you're going to use this font size, you have no choice. You have to either left justify or right justify. Only if it's small enough can you center justify. Now, you might think, oh, no problem. I can get around this because I can hyphenate. And so in the scientific literature, hyphenation is almost always turned off. I would turn it off in general. It makes your text harder to read. And auto hyphenation does not work very well. And the editor at the journal is going to remove it. So just turn hyphenation off everywhere. And only when you really, really have to, should you be hyphenating your words. Okay, so that's the first two principles of graphic design. Let's get to the next one, which is repetition. And repetition is what can really make things pop. So what you want to do is you want to be repeating visual elements of the design throughout the piece. And it doesn't really matter what you repeat. So you can repeat colors in different places. You can repeat fonts. You can repeat sizes, textures, line thicknesses. And so by doing this judiciously, you can make the entire piece, your entire poster, your entire graphic, pull itself together. Now, there's a really important corollary with this. And the corollary is if you are going to be repeating things, then you should be using fewer colors. So you should be using a few colors in your graphic, but repeat them. Ideally, when you're putting a presentation together, ideally you repeat the colors all the way through. And your audience may or may not notice this in their conscious mind, but viscerally, it will cause everything to hang together better. So try not to use every color of the rainbow on every slide. Okay, so let's try to do this on this poor, ugly business card. If you wanted to repeat something, one possibility here would be to try and repeat this font somewhere. So you could do something like this. You could echo this large blocky font down here with the phone number. And you can see that that tends to pull these two together in a way that makes it feel more composed than the original. Okay, here is an example of basically any kind of newsletter you have ever seen. And you can see that this person who has put this together is trying to bring things together, trying to have some headers that set off the different thoughts in whatever this newsletter is about. But it doesn't really pop. You can see it, but it doesn't draw your attention the way it should. So what would work much better is to make the repetition much more obvious. So in this case, I have made the things that I am repeating stand out much more, give it a little bit more contrast. The other thing is by having repeated white space between these different things in your graphic, that tends to bring the different parts together. So you immediately know, for example, that this column joins with this column here, and this bit of text all joins together. So in general, when you are putting together reports, when you are putting together resumes, anything like this, what you want to do is you want to have a strong contrasting theme for the heads and the subheads. You want people's eyes to immediately know where all of the different headings are and where to find the information beneath each one of these headings. Okay, almost through. The fourth principle of graphic design is contrast. And this is the one that really brings everything together. Contrast is very often the most important visual attraction on a page. If you have a very highly contrasting poster, when people look out at a sea of posters, they'll say, oh, that one looks so much better than the others. I need to go and check that out. Now, what is the idea behind contrast? The idea behind contrast is if you are going to make things contrast, make them contrast, make them very different. What you don't want to have is things on the page that are different, but actually sort of similar, because that doesn't help you out. Another way of saying this is don't be a contrast wimp. Okay, don't try to contrast bold times 18 with times 18. There's a little bit of contrast there, but that is not what is meant by contrast. If you want to make a contrast, notice what I'm doing. So here I have a different font, big, bold 28-point font contrasting with a skinny 18-point font. So if the elements, and by elements, I mean essentially anything, the type, the color, the size, line thicknesses, spacing, anything else are not the same, then make them very different. Okay, so if you are going to make them very different, one of the things that means is you're probably going to want to be using different fonts. And so usually I will use a couple of different fonts when I'm putting together a proposal, when I'm putting together a report, when I'm putting together graphics. So how do you decide which fonts you're going to use for contrast? Well, there are two different types of fonts, and they are designed for different purposes. So there are what some people call the legible fonts, and there are what some people call the readable fonts. And they're very easy to tell apart from one another, because what you do is you look up in the corners of the letters up here, and you say, are there any curly cues up here? So notice in this readable font up here, there are little curly cues. In the legible fonts, there are no curly cues. Now, these two fonts are designed for different things. The legible fonts have been designed for ease of character recognition, so there's no little frills on any of the characters. The readable fonts are actually, when you read, you recognize the shape of words much more than you're recognizing the shape of letters. And so they have been designed to make blocks of text be readable, i.e. paragraphs. So these two types of fonts have different names, and they're named as to whether they have curly cues or not. So these curly cues are called serifs. So the readable fonts are known as the serif fonts. The legible fonts are known as the sans serif fonts. And so every font is one or the other. Of the sans serif fonts, the most common one is Helvetica. As many of you know, you need to use Helvetica or Arial on all of your graphics for journal publications, but there are many others. Gill Sans is a quite nice font, Trebuchet, and then there are other more specialized like Tecton, Impact, and so on and so forth. So these are the kinds of things that you are going to use to label your graphs because people are recognizing a word or two. This is typically what you use in presentations. However, it's not what you use to write your thesis, at least hopefully, if I'm going to have to read it. For writing your thesis, for writing extended blocks of text, Times is sort of the standard. Garamond is much prettier, much more beautiful in my thinking. And then there's things like Palantino, and then there's specialized fonts like Courier and Apple Chancery. So use the legible fonts for headers and headlines, use the readable fonts for your paragraphs, and use this when you are putting together your reports, your proposals, your CVs. This is going to be one of the ways you're going to get this contrast and you are going to pull things together. So this brings us to the topic of CVs. And this looks like about 1 billion CVs that I have ever seen. I have seen things that are worse, but this is pretty standard. So it has some good things. It did try to have some headers, which are sort of, you can sort of see them out from the rest of the text. It did try to separate the different entries a little bit, but it doesn't really pull the different parts of the CV together. And so all of this is hard left justified. For some reason down here, things suddenly go to center justified. So this is now just floating off on its own, as is this name up here. So it is a matter of literally 5 minutes to turn this from just a random CV that you've seen a gazillion times to something that actually looks a lot better. But before I tell you how to do this, let me also point out this idea of using all caps, don't do that. Just never do it, never ever. There are many other things to do. All caps does not work. It's hard to read. It is not professional. So we can use these ideas to pull this together. And so here, notice what he has done is he has taken his name and the different sections of the CV. They are all now set in a very different font than he is using to write all of the stuff in his CV. All of the sections are now pulled together with these rules, which join together things that are on the left and things together on the right. Personally, I would not have set this so far to the right. I would have probably pulled it a bit more towards the left. This was a style that was very common 15 years ago, and I think it's looking pretty dated. But I think if you compare the beginning and the end, even though they have exactly the same information on them, this is a much more visually appealing CV. Okay. So that's how to make your CV pop. Here's another example for yet another newsletter. This is better than the one that I showed you earlier in that now there's a different color that is pulling out the subheads. And the subheads actually have different font sizes. And so that gives you a little bit of a way of distinguishing what's going on. But still, it doesn't really pop. It doesn't really draw the eye in. It just looks like yet another thing that my undergraduates turn in, but this is a slightly better undergraduate who has a color printer. So what you want to do here is you really want to bump up the contrast. Try to make the different pieces stand out. One of the best ways of doing this is to use color. And by color, color doesn't even need to mean color. It can just mean reversing color and having white on black instead of black on white. But you can see by adding this different colored banner, by really changing the contrast between the heads and the text, things pop. And by saying things pop, again, what I mean is your eye automatically knows what to do. It automatically knows title, head, subhead, head, subhead. You know where to look to find the information. It's not so much about being beautiful, it's knowing exactly where to look to find the information. And you are going to use these principles not to put together newsletters, but to try and get people to understand your rather difficult scientific concepts and to get them to go from step 1 of your experiment all the way through step 15 of your experiment. And the only way to do that effectively is to think about how you can use these principles to break everything down into sections. Okay, here is another example drawn from a web page. Again, this is not the worst web page I have ever seen. Immediately, you see that there is a title section, there's information stuff. There is some kind of menu, you know, to go and click on this if you're interested in any of this. But you can take it up a notch by really turning up the contrast. Turning up the contrast maybe by using a colored panel to separate the title off from the rest. And notice it's not just using contrast, but I'm also using, or she is using repeated things. So what is repeated here? Well, notice the repetition in the color. So there are 3 primary colors. So there is the purple, there is the yellowish orange here, and then there's black and also white. And by having just those 2 main colors and black and white, it's much more crisp, it's much more appealing, and it looks like someone put this together who actually knows how to design websites. Okay, so that was a very quick walk through this book. I hit all of the highlights. It will go through this in much gorier detail, and importantly, it will give you more examples. And as you walk through these examples, you will begin to look out on the world in a different way. And when you look at billboards, when you look at advertisements, when you look at journal layouts, when you look at science, you will begin to see how people have subtly used these principles to draw the whole package together. So again, really the 4 ideas here are contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. And you have to figure out some way of remembering those 4 things, because I just don't know how to do that. Now, having said all of this, there is one thing that I did not talk about, and that unfortunately Robin Williams does not go into in her book. And it's the thing that people always ask me about, and that is, what about color? I'm a scientist, you know, I am doing good to get my top to match my bottoms. And I do that by wearing either jeans or black pants. So what do you do about color? And the reason Robin Williams doesn't talk about it is this is a complicated thing. And, you know, some people are better about it than others. So let me tell you how you could do this in a way that would make what you're doing look much more professional if you pull it off. And so the way to do this is when you put together your talk, when you put together your poster, you need to use a consistent color scheme. And it needs to be a color scheme that is not grotty and ugly. The way to do this, or the easy way to do this, is that many graphics programs will generate a color scheme from you if you tell it just 1 color or 2 colors that you want to use. So Illustrator will do this. I'm pretty sure that the Affinity products will as well. But there's also a free option, which is sort of fun to play with. So you can go to color.adobe.com. So let's just imagine you are Richie Patterson. You have just got this big center that has been funded, and now you need to put together a website, you need to put together a logo, you need to put together PowerPoint presentations and all that kind of good stuff. And the question is what do you do? Well, what you do, and what Richie did, was apparently decided on 1 color that she liked, which was a red. So you go then to this website, color.adobe.com, and you're faced with this little circle thingy here, and these little circles in it. What you do is you grab this little circle here that has the white dot, And you are going to use that circle to choose your base color. So now what I have done is I have dragged this to approximately CBB red. And then after you choose your base color, this program will use the principles of color coordination to figure out what is a good color scheme. So the next thing you do after you choose your base color is you choose the method for making your colors. And there is no one rule for things that look good. There is some judgment here. What I am showing you here is the triad method of choosing colors. Split complementary is also quite nice. And there are other methods for choosing this scheme. Once you choose the method and your base color, this program will generate 5 colors for you that you can use for your layout. And so what you can then do, this is your scheme, and there is a way you can put your scheme into PowerPoint using these instructions. And so then in PowerPoint, you have 5 base colors that you can click on, and you can use various shades of this. Now, is this the color scheme that I would have used? Maybe not. Maybe I would have used something different. But this is the professional way of getting a color scheme for your presentation. Okay, but realistically, are you going to do that? No, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that in my next life, and I'm going to be all nice and color coordinated. But realistically, I'm just going to keep wearing black jeans and blue jeans and change my tops. So what do I do when I need to choose colors? Well, there is a very simple rule that will keep you from being hideous. And the very simple rule, which was not obvious to me when I started out, is that unless you're a Muppet, don't use primary colors, okay? And you will see so many people when they try to emphasize something on their slide, they immediately jump to bright red. And bright red is just jarring. So instead of going for the bright red, tone it down a little bit. Go to a more maroon, go to something like this. Lime green just sucks. It looks bad in every possible respect. It has low contrast. It makes your eyes hurt. Tone it down to clover. Yellow doesn't work. Tone it down to orange. So that's my general idea. Just pick a red, a blue, tone them off of primary colors, and use a few colors that sort of go together. Now, the one thing you have to be very careful with, and if you have not given a lot of talks, you may not figure it out, is that LCD projectors just suck, okay? And when you go to give a talk at another university, guaranteed that projector is going to suck worse than anything you have ever done. Clark 700 used to have the world's worst LCD projector, and I actually paid to have it replaced because it was so bad. So the colors that you see on your laptop are going to bear a very vague resemblance of what you are going to see out on the screen. So if you're going to go give a job talk, I really encourage you to take your talk to some of the classrooms around your institution and to see how hideous they look, and to take care that things look great even on a bad projector. Okay. So let me go really quickly through now how you would use these principles to design a scientific poster. And it's very simple. And what you're trying to do is to put together a good scientific poster, because it's your science that's going to draw people in. You want to make sure that your poster does not turn them away. So the strategy that most people use is to design your poster in blocks. And you're going to use the same style for each block so that people immediately recognize what is a block. And your goal in doing this, again, is not to be the most beautiful poster on the block. You're trying to design so that people's eyeballs are steered through your poster and they can figure out very quickly whether they actually want to talk to you. So in 2 minutes, how do you design a scientific poster? Well, you have a title that is at the top in very, very large font, so people can see it way across the room and be drawn in. Typically, if you're in a center, we'll tell you what you have to put in the upper left, in the upper right-hand corner. Then what you're going to do is you're going to tell your story in a linear format. starting with why should anyone care about your poster? And this is really important. You need to have the take-home message front and center. So you have to convince people, why should I spend time looking at this poster? The second most important thing on your poster is thank the nice people who pay for your tuition and your salary. So the acknowledgments, and typically put the conclusions right above that. Okay, now what you're going to do is just use standard book format to put everything else in. So you are going to put things in columns. You'll start your story here and go down, then the story will continue here, then the story will continue here, because that's the way people are used to reading. So what do you put next? Depends on the poster. Maybe you'll put your experimental section here. Maybe the next thing you'll put is the results you got from your first experiment, which weren't so good. So maybe you spiced it up a little, did something different. You put some graphene on there. So you'll talk about the effects of graphene. Then maybe you had Kevin do some theory for you. So you'll talk about Kevin's theoretical results, and boom, you've got your poster together. And notice that right now it's very clear what the layout is. And the reason that the layout is so clear is actually because you have this nice bit of white space here. It's the white space that is defining the columns. Okay, but this is pretty, okay, honestly, this looks like a lot of posters that I have seen. You can spice it up in 2 minutes and make it look much better. So you can do something like this, okay? Now going to this is going to be better than at least 75% of the posters that you are competing against. So the way you have done this is you have used the principles of graphic design to make things more attractive. And how have you done that? First, is there contrast? Yes, you now have goo-gobs of contrast. First, the title block is set off in a bright purple, so everyone can see that across the room. There's really strong contrast between your headers and your actual text. The fact that you have these nice big areas of white space, as I say, makes it obvious that there are columns there, so we know to read in columnar format. Is there repetition? Yes, there's lots of repetition. We have exactly the same header form for each one of these headers. So the headers pop out against the rest of the poster. You're using the same font for the title as for the headers, same font for the text through all of the text in here. Is there alignment? Yes, there is alignment. You have these columns, but notice that there's even better alignment here because the headers are aligned, but then the text is indented just slightly. So the text has a relationship to the header that's more than just the alignment. Is there proximity? Yes, you can see that each one of these subblocks is proximal to a header. So you immediately know where to look to find what you're interested in. If you're only interested in theory, that immediately pops out to you. But most importantly, what you should ask yourself is, have you achieved eyeball control? When you look at this, do you know where to look to get the information that you are looking for? Can you scan this very quickly, figure out where to look if you're only interested in, say, experimental results or who funded this? And the answer is yes. Okay, so when I usually give this talk, this is the first half, and then we sit down for 30 minutes and we go through about a dozen posters that I pulled off of the internet. And we ask, why did this poster work? Why did this poster not work? How could I make it better? Because the problem is when you put a poster together, you are emotionally tied to it and you think it looks great. So looking at someone else's poster first and saying, why does this not work? How did someone try to use the principles of graphic design, but then just go completely off the rails and make something that is absolutely and totally hideous? But that's never going to work on Zoom. So what I am going to do is I'm going to put these slides on Indico and you will be able to download them. And I really do strongly encourage you to flip through these and ask yourself, how could I make this slide be less hideous? Okay, and with that, I'm sorry that I went over time on this, but this was as short as I could make it. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Are there questions out there? I'll ask a question. Or Joan, are there questions out there? I'm not too sure. So Melissa, often on posters, you see sort of boxes all over the place. Do you have comments on boxes? Is that helpful in guiding the eye or what?
I would say usually you can make it more attractive without the boxes. Usually what I see people doing when they're trying to use boxes is they're trying to put so much information on the poster that they feel it's necessary to put boxes around things to try and make it logical. I think it looks very clean to leave white spaces between different parts of the poster. But I will say, I have seen very appealing posters that use boxes. And I have seen other posters that are not so appealing that try to do it with white space. So it is a matter of taste. But I would say that don't try and sneak more stuff on your poster than can logically fit.
Okay. And this is a question. Do you have one thing that's an issue for slide presentations, not so much on Zoom, but when you're doing them in a room with a screen, is the font size. And you see graphs that you can't read what the horizontal axis are. And do you have a rule of thumb for a minimum font size that can be seen? Other rules of thumb about that kind of thing for slides.
So I have a whole talk on scientific presentations, which is also on YouTube, that goes through all of this. The best way of doing this, in my opinion, is that when you are giving your talk and when you are practicing your talk, you have to get up and you have to walk away from your laptop and talk to the dog. And look at your screen from a distance. And it depends on how old you are, how far you need to get away from the screen. So for you and me, 8 feet might work. If you're a young whippersnapper, it's going to be more like 12 feet, something like that. And at that distance, as you go through your talk, you have to see absolutely everything that is on the screen. That means every label, every scale bar. Microscopists, you are bad about this. If you show me an image and there's no scale bar that I can see, I don't know whether you're looking at billiard balls or atoms. Everything has to be visible. If you can't read it, get rid of it. What does that translate to? It does depend a lot on the font. I would say, the bare minimum is 16, but 16 in a lot of cases is not big enough. Plus, there are a lot of people who make their graphics in one package and then put it onto their slides. So if it's 16 in one package and then you shrink it down by a factor of 4, it's no longer 16. So the best thing is to actually look at the screen from a distance and say, can I actually read this?
When you say look at a screen, are you talking about broadcasting it or your computer screen or what?
So usually when I practice my talks, I'm practicing it on my laptop. And that's why I'm talking about 8 or 10 feet. If you actually want to go into, Clark 700 or something like that, that would be great. Practicing it in an actual lecture hall works very well. But usually what I do is I stand up and I walk away from my laptop and I give my talk out loud. And I know that I have the right level of enthusiasm if the dog jumps up and wants to dance with me.
Right. I have a question. You may have covered this. I may have missed it, but how do you choose what's the right amount of text to put on a poster? Because sometimes your poster will be posted up and you won't be there to talk. So sometimes, like, there's some advantages of having more text so it's readable.
Yeah, but honestly, how many times do you actually stop at, say, a theoretical physics poster and read the text on it? It's not all that common. I would say that your poster is really more of an advertisement than an in-depth discussion of what you actually did. So maybe having a little bit more text about the take-home message and the conclusions is okay. But honestly, 1,000 or 2,000 words is going to be more than enough. Having less is more. And the bang for your buck for a poster comes from two things. A, the actual poster session where you're talking to people, you're meeting people, and that's what's going to help you the most. And then the second thing is having it hanging out in the hall. And there, people are looking at it as they walk past, and realistically, they're not going to read anything that you write up there. They're looking for the cool graphics. And maybe if they walk past it, for enough days at a time, they'll stop and look at it, but you don't get a lot of mileage out of that.